I woke up to the overwhelming smell of burning oil, thick and sharp in the morning air. I rubbed my eyes, disoriented, and stumbled out of bed, still half asleep, trying to shake off the grogginess. But then I saw it. My heart dropped. In the front yard, a blaze was raging, a massive fire that lit up the early morning sky. I thought at first it was some kind of bonfire, but then I realized with growing horror, it wasn't a bonfire. It was my tractor, Bessie, my beloved, hard-working tractor. The one that had been with me for decades. The one that had helped me through countless harvests and long, grueling workdays. Now it was just a burning pile of metal, oil and rubber, sending thick plumes of smoke into the air. For a moment I was frozen, watching as the fire consumed it, my hands trembling in disbelief. This wasn't just some random accident. No, it was a statement. A deliberate act of destruction, a cruel message sent by the Homeowners Association, the HOA, that I had always considered a minor nuisance. I never thought they'd go this far, but now I realized they had crossed a line. I had thought of them as just an annoying bunch of busybodies who like to fuss about trivial matters. But now, in the face of my smoldering tractor, I saw them for what they truly were, tyrants, wielding power they had no right to possess. I stood there barefoot on the damp grass, my robe billowing in the wind as I watched the last 20 years of hard work and memories turn to ashes. My mind was racing, but there was no time for panic or grief. On the sidewalk, a small group of HOA members were gathered, their faces smug, their whispers dripping with satisfaction. They were celebrating my loss as if burning my tractor was some great accomplishment. And at the front of the group, as always, was Cynthia Fairweather, the Queen of Oak Estates. She stood tall, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. A grin plastered across her face as she looked at me, her eyes full of that unmistakable mix of fake sympathy and arrogance. She was wearing an expensive blazer, and her expression screamed, "I'm in control." "This is what happens, Mr. Calloway," she said in that overly sweet tone of hers, like she was delivering bad news to a child. "When people refuse to follow community guidelines, we have to take action." I felt my fists clench, not because I was the type to solve problems that way, but because I could feel the rage building inside me, a force I could barely control. The other members of the HOA shifted uncomfortably as I stepped forward. My gaze never left Cynthia's. I spoke slowly, my voice calm but carrying the weight of 100 unspoken threats. "You burned my tractor." Cynthia blinked in surprise, then tried to muster a smile. "It was a community decision," she said, her voice dripping with false politeness. "You were given ample opportunity to remove that eyesore from your yard. We enforce aesthetic harmony here in Oak Estates, and unfortunately you left us with no choice." I didn't respond, my heart pounding in my chest. But my mind was already calculating the next steps. I knew one thing for sure. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. 3 weeks before the fire, I had received the first letter from the HOA. It was professionally typed, neatly folded, and stamped with their ridiculous logo, a small tree and a house in some pretentious font. The letter itself was every bit as condescending, as you'd expect from a group of self-important bureaucrats who thought they ruled the world. The words were polite, but dripping with the kind of artificial courtesy that made you feel like you were being scolded by someone who enjoyed it. The letter began, "Dear Mr. Calloway, as a resident of Oak Estates, you are required to comply with all community guidelines set forth by the Homeowners Association." The first line was like a slap in the face. I had lived in this neighborhood long before the HOA ever existed. I had no need for their community guidelines, my land, my house, my rules. But they didn't see it that way. The letter went on to list a series of so-called violations. Apparently, my tractor, Bessie, was an unauthorized, dilapidated agricultural vehicle parked in public view, as if a piece of machinery I used to feed my family was a crime. The letter also accused me of failure to maintain aesthetically pleasing landscaping, which was laughable considering I had one of the most well-kept yards on the block. And then there was the final straw: repeated failure to register as an HOA member, despite multiple invitations. Invitations? They weren't invitations. They were demands wrapped in pleasantries. The letter concluded with a thinly veiled threat: Failure to comply with these regulations by the end of the month will result in escalating enforcement measures. I remember laughing out loud when I read that. I wasn't a member of the HOA, and I had no intention of ever becoming one. They had no authority over me. As far as I was concerned, this whole HOA nonsense was a toddler's tantrum in a fancy suit, and I wasn't going to let it control my life. I ignored the letter. Then came another one and another, each more insistent than the last, each one slipping under my door or stuck to the windshield of my truck. I couldn't believe it. One time, they even taped a letter to my dog. Their audacity was beyond belief, but I was too busy to care. That was until one Saturday afternoon, when Cynthia Fairweather herself showed up on my porch. She was there with her enforcer, Greg Whitmore, a man who seemed to have made it his life's mission to play HOA compliance officer. He was the kind of man who never had any real authority in life. But the second he was handed a clipboard, he thought he could control the world. "Mr. Calloway," Cynthia began in her sweetest, most patronizing tone, "I assume you've received our notices." "I have," I said, leaning against the porch railing with a beer in my hand. I hadn't even bothered to read them. Her nostrils flared slightly. "You're in violation of multiple HOA policies," Greg said, pointing to my yard like it was a crime scene. "Your lawn exceeds the allowed blade height by 2 inches. Your mailbox is not regulation standard and—" He paused dramatically. "That," he pointed at Bessie, "is an unregistered agricultural vehicle." I looked at him, blinking in disbelief. "It's a tractor, Greg." Cynthia pursed her lips. "Mr. Calloway, if you do not join the HOA and comply with its regulations, we will be forced to take action." I waved them off, laughing. The whole situation was so absurd it almost felt like a joke. But I knew one thing: this wouldn't end here, not by a long shot. The next time they decided to play their little game, they were going to regret it. After the incident with the letters and Cynthia's visit, I spent the next few weeks trying to move on with my life. But it was hard to shake off the irritation from the HOA's constant interference. They wouldn't leave me alone, sending me notices, sticking them under my door, or even placing them on my truck's windshield. Like some kind of ridiculous street vendors, they were relentless, and their power trips seemed to know no bounds. They had now set their sights on my land, and after the tractor incident, I knew it was only a matter of time before they escalated. What they didn't realize was that they were pushing me to the edge. And when someone like me gets pushed too far, they find a way to push back. That was when I started gathering my evidence. I didn't just sit there fuming. No, I was going to make sure they understood the kind of trouble they were about to bring upon themselves. I began by documenting every single violation they had committed. I wasn't just talking about the petty things, my lawn being an inch too tall or the mailbox not meeting their aesthetic standards. No, I was looking at the bigger picture. The fire hazards, the safety violations, the illegalities that were hiding in plain sight, waiting to be uncovered. The HOA members had been so busy policing trivial details that they had ignored real dangers lurking within Oak Estates. I started taking notes, pulling out old fire codes I had kept from my years in the fire department. My experience had taught me something the HOA clearly didn't understand. Every neighborhood is a potential fire hazard waiting to happen, and Oak Estates was a ticking time bomb. From unapproved propane tanks, stacked too close to homes, to poorly constructed wooden fences that could fuel an uncontrollable fire spread. This place was a disaster waiting to happen. I even noticed fire hydrants were blocked by decorative landscaping, making them impossible to reach in case of an emergency. The more I looked, the more violations I found. It was almost impressive how badly they had screwed themselves. I wasn't going to stop there, though. I wanted to make sure the HOA didn't just get a slap on the wrist. I called in a favor from an old friend, Captain Riley, over at the fire department. I asked him if he was interested in taking a little tour of Oak Estates to do a full fire safety inspection. He was more than happy to oblige. I knew it was going to cause a stir, but I didn't care. They had destroyed my tractor, and now I was going to destroy their so-called perfect community. I couldn't wait to see the look on their faces when the fire department showed up unannounced and started marking hazards with bright red stickers. Little did they know the real storm was about to hit. I was going to make sure they paid for every mistake they had made. I wasn't just fighting back, I was fighting for the truth. And that truth would burn them. The next morning, after I had contacted Captain Riley and started making plans to gather all my evidence, I sat back on my porch with a cup of coffee in hand. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a golden glow over the quiet street. But I knew peace was not going to last. The HOA patrol was already out in force, marching up and down the street like soldiers, clipboard in hand, looking for any excuse to find the residents. Greg Whitmore, Cynthia's enforcer and the self-proclaimed compliance officer, was strutting down the sidewalk with his usual smug grin, ready to nitpick anything that wasn't up to code. It was almost laughable watching them go through the motions. Clipboard in hand, acting as if they were some sort of neighborhood task force. They weren't doing anything to keep the community safe. No, they were out there to ensure conformity, to quash any semblance of individuality. The whole charade was a sad display of how far they were willing to go, to maintain their grip on power, the kind of people who never had any real authority. But the second they were handed a set of rules to enforce, they thought they could control everything. It was a pathetic power trip, and I had seen it before. Greg and his little crew paused in front of my house, acting as if they were about to write me up for something else. They were too focused on their little crusade to notice that I was watching them closely. Coffee in hand. Greg glanced at me briefly, his irritation clear when I didn't react the way he expected. He was used to people cowering, apologizing for minor infractions, but not me. I wasn't about to play along. I just raised my mug and gave him a small wave, watching as his face twisted with frustration. The group continued their walk, and as they passed, I leaned back in my chair, my mind already working. I had spent the entire morning compiling my evidence. I had found enough fire code violations in Oak D estates to make the whole neighborhood a ticking time bomb. Unapproved propane tanks stacked way too close to homes. Wooden fences too high, creating an uncontrollable spread risk in case of a fire. Fire lanes blocked by unnecessary landscaping. Hydrants that couldn't be reached. The more I dug, the clearer it became that this whole neighborhood was a disaster waiting to happen. And yet here they were, focused on trivialities like lawn height and mailbox standards. By the time Captain Riley arrived with his team, I had everything in place. The inspection would be the first domino to fall. I knew the HOA had no idea what they were about to face. As Riley's team started marking fire hazards and taking notes, I stood back and watched the chaos unfold. The residents were confused, but I knew this was just the beginning. This wasn't just about some petty neighborhood dispute. No, this was about bringing down an entire system of control that had oppressed so many. The HOA's perfect little world was about to shatter. The moment Captain Riley and his team arrived in Oak D Estates, it felt like a small earthquake had hit the neighborhood. The fire trucks rolled in, their sirens cutting through the usual peace of the suburban streets. I watched from my porch, a grin creeping up on my face as I saw the residents peek out of their windows. Confused and uncertain about what was happening, Riley wasn't just there to conduct a fire safety inspection. He was about to open Pandora's box. This wasn't a routine check. It was a storm that would leave the HOA scrambling to cover their tracks. I had spent hours gathering everything I could, photos, notes, and detailed records of every violation I could find in Oak D Estates. The HOA had spent years creating their perfect little community, focused on the trivial, like whether your lawn was an inch too tall, while ignoring real, dangerous hazards. Now it was all coming back to haunt them. As Riley and his team started to inspect the area, the neighborhood's flaws became glaringly obvious. Fire lanes were blocked by unnecessarily high fences. Propane tanks, unapproved and dangerously close to homes, were scattered across yards. Hydrants were completely inaccessible, buried under decorative landscaping that obstructed the flow of water in case of an emergency. I watched as the inspectors marked hazard after hazard, each red sticker a sign of the HOA's incompetence. The more they uncovered, the more ridiculous it all seemed. How could Cynthia and her board have let this happen? Greg Whitmore, seeing the direction this was heading, tried to sneak away, but I spotted him before he could make a quick exit. He was nervous, twitching, and for the first time, I saw the man who had once strutted around with the power of the HOA behind him start to crack. He knew his little empire was crumbling, and he had no idea how to stop it. I caught up with him before he could escape. "You know," I said casually, leaning against his car, "arson is a pretty serious crime." Greg's face went pale. He stammered, trying to deny it. But I pulled out my phone and showed him the footage. It was clear as day. Greg was standing way too close to my tractor, just before the fire started, a lighter flicking in his hand. His reaction was immediate, the blood draining from his face as he saw the proof in front of him. "I don't know what you're talking about," he mumbled, but it was too late. I had him. The fire department wasn't the only authority I had on my side. I gave Greg a choice: confess, or I'd turn the footage over to the fire department and let them handle it. He chose the former, babbling about following orders. But it didn't matter now. I had him, and I was about to bring Cynthia and her entire HOA board down. The look on Greg's face told me everything I needed to know. They were in deep, and their little reign over Oakdale Estates was about to come to a screeching halt. That evening, after Greg had confessed, I knew it was time to take the next step. I wasn't going to let this whole mess slide. I had the proof, and now it was time to make sure the HOA paid for what they had done. The next morning, as I sipped my coffee, I received an envelope slipped under my door. Another notice from Cynthia and her band of self-righteous HOA members. But this time, the letter wasn't the usual demand for compliance or a warning about fines. No, this was different. It was marked in big, bold letters, "Final Warning." The letter went on to reiterate everything that had already been said. "You are in violation of HOA regulations, and failure to comply will result in escalating enforcement actions." But this time the stakes were higher. They weren't just threatening fines anymore. This letter was talking about possible legal action, and worst of all, eviction from Oakdale Estates. I couldn't help but laugh when I read the words. Eviction? From a place I had lived long before this HOA even existed. The sheer audacity of Cynthia and her cronies was infuriating. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like the last desperate move of a group that could feel their control slipping away. I wasn't about to be intimidated by a piece of paper. I had been dealing with their threats for weeks, and now they were trying to force me out of my own home. They had no idea who they were messing with. I had spent 30 years in the fire department, dealing with the worst kind of emergencies, and I wasn't about to let a bunch of petty bureaucrats push me around. I didn't respond to the letter immediately, but I knew exactly what I was going to do. That night I sat down and went through all my security footage again, frame by frame, making sure everything was perfect. I knew I had already gathered enough evidence to bury them, but I wanted to make sure there were no gaps, no room for them to wriggle out of this. As I watched the footage of Bessie going up in flames, I spotted the moment that had changed everything. There it was again, the flicker of Greg's face in the glow of the flames. Just before the fire started, I knew that was the final nail in the coffin. The next day, I sent the footage to the local fire department, the police, and even the city council. Everyone needed to see what had really been going on behind closed doors. It was time to put the nail in the coffin of the HOA's reign over Oakdale Estates. What happened next was a whirlwind. The HOA, already under fire for the countless violations in the neighborhood, suddenly found themselves in the hot seat for something much worse: arson. Greg was now directly implicated in the fire that destroyed my tractor. The investigation that followed wasn't just about codes and fines. It was about criminal activity, and Cynthia and her team couldn't escape the consequences. The HOA's grip on the neighborhood was slipping, and I was ready to make sure it never regained control. The next few days were a whirlwind. The news spread quickly through Oakdale Estates like wildfire, and the HOA's carefully constructed empire began to crumble. The investigation into the fire was quickly escalating. No one could ignore the fact that the HOA, under the leadership of Cynthia Fairweather, had allowed such gross safety violations to fester for so long. But the real bombshell came when the fire department confirmed what I had known all along. Greg Whitmore had been directly responsible for starting the fire that destroyed my tractor. The news hit the neighborhood hard. What had once been a seemingly perfect community was now a disaster zone. Both figuratively and literally, people were starting to realize just how many rules the HOA had been ignoring in their quest for control. and the violations were much worse than they had ever imagined. As the fire department and law enforcement officials continued their investigation, it became clear that the HOA's actions weren't just negligence, they were criminal. And now, Cynthia and her fellow board members had nowhere to hide. The morning after the investigation began, the atmosphere in Oak Estates was charged with tension. Residents had started talking. Conversations that had never happened before were suddenly unfolding in front yards, over fences and in driveways. People were angry, confused, and scared. The HOA, the very organization that had promised to keep the neighborhood safe and orderly, had failed them in the worst possible way. There were rumors swirling, whispers of lawsuits, and discussions of whether the neighborhood could function without the HOA altogether. But Cynthia wasn't done fighting. She called an emergency HOA meeting, gathering the board members and anyone who would listen to her. It was clear that the pressure was getting to her. She tried to maintain her composure, but I could see the cracks in her facade. The once dominant queen of Oak Estates was now on the defensive, struggling to hold on to whatever little control she had left. The meeting didn't go well for her, and as the evening wore on, it became increasingly clear that the board members were no longer loyal to her. Some were trying to salvage their reputations, while others were downright terrified of the impending legal action. I wasn't invited to the meeting, but I didn't need to be. I had already gathered the evidence. I needed to make sure the HOA would never operate the same way again. As the meeting wore on, I decided it was time to show up. I walked into the room uninvited, just as the board members were arguing over how to handle the growing crisis. Cynthia's face turned a shade of red I hadn't seen before as she tried to maintain control. "Looks like you've got a real mess on your hands," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. I took a step forward, letting my presence settle over the room. The moment I spoke, every eye turned toward me, and I knew I had them. The tension in the room was palpable. Cynthia attempted to push back, her usual confidence slipping, but I could see the defeat in her eyes. She knew what was coming. The tables had turned. The next morning, the entire dynamic of Oak Estates had shifted. The news of the investigation and the mounting fire safety violations was spreading like wildfire. The residents, once loyal to the HOA out of fear or indifference, were now questioning everything. The bubble of perfection that the HOA had carefully crafted had burst, and what was left in its wake was a neighborhood in chaos. People were angry, their frustrations boiling over, as they realized how much control they had handed over to an organization that had not only ignored safety regulations but had actively imposed unnecessary rules that affected their daily lives. The HOA members, now scrambling to salvage what little was left of their reputations, were making desperate attempts to maintain some semblance of authority. But the damage was done. Cynthia Fairweather, the self-proclaimed queen of Oak Estates, was no longer the powerful figure she once was. The once pristine streets, lined with immaculate lawns and perfectly trimmed hedges, were now filled with residents who had been awakened to the truth. They were no longer afraid to speak out. Conversations that had never happened before were taking place openly, and people were coming together, sharing their frustrations, and even laughing over old grievances. As I sat back and watched the scene unfold, I knew the time had come for the final blow. The HOA, already on the defensive, was now fighting to keep itself from completely crumbling. Cynthia called for an emergency meeting, inviting the remaining board members to discuss how to respond to the growing pressure, but she had already lost control. The board members were no longer supporting her. They were trying to distance themselves from the scandal and the criminal charges that were rapidly approaching. I wasn't invited to the meeting, but that didn't stop me. I showed up unannounced, walking into the small, stuffy room where the board was holding their desperate discussions. The tension was thick in the air, and Cynthia's face was flushed with a mix of frustration and panic as she tried to dictate the terms of the meeting. As I entered, every head turned toward me. I could feel the power shift in the room as they realized they were no longer in control. I stepped forward, my presence undeniable. "Looks like you've got a real mess on your hands," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. The board members shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Cynthia straightened, trying to mask her fear with her usual arrogance, but I could see it in her eyes. The realization that her reign over Oakdale Estates was over. I didn't need to stay for the vote. I knew how it would go. The power had already shifted, and the HOA's days were numbered. The next morning, Oakdale Estates felt like a different place. The once stifling atmosphere had lightened, and the residents who had been afraid to speak out were now sharing stories, laughing over old grudges, and, for the first time in a long while, enjoying the freedom that had been taken from them. The story reflects the abuse of power by a HOA, Homeowners Association, where they not only make life difficult for residents with unreasonable rules, but also resort to cruel actions, such as HOA burned the protagonist's tractor as a means of intimidation. The fake HOA represents an organization that is more focused on control and power than the well-being of the community. The HOA drama and HOA stories of conflict between residents and the board reveal the deceit and corruption within this organization. The story serves as a warning against tyrannical HOA entities, showing that when they cross the line, justice and revenge will eventually make them pay the price. What do you think about the actions of the HOA in the story? Do you believe they went too far?